Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a secret waiting to be heard. A truth withheld is a ghost that haunts the space between what is said and what is meant. In the sterile, subterranean chill of the Dragon's Gate boardroom, where empires were traded in hushed tones amidst the scent of industrial floor wax and aggressive cologne, a catastrophe was brewing in the subtext. Amara felt it in the jagged rhythm of the translation, a sharp dissonance cutting through the room's cold, calculated efficiency. She moved along the perimeter with a practiced erasure of self, a phantom in a bright blue uniform and white trim, her existence reduced to the rhythmic circular motion of a cloth against mahogany. But she was not just a cleaner. She was a silent witness recording the frequencies that no one else cared to tune into. Her hands, rhythmic and sure as they wiped away a condensation ring, did not betray the surge of adrenaline that threatened to break her cover. She had been a corpse for 3 years, ever since the fires in Lagos had consumed her name, leaving her in this hollow, neon-lit purgatory. Tonight, however, the dead were waking up, and their voices were speaking in Russian. The transition from intelligence analyst to custodian had been a slow, agonizing death of the ego. In the sterile corridors of the Dragon's Gate, Amara Okoye moved like a shadow cast by a flickering lamp, there, yet impossible to grasp. She had learned the choreography of the discarded, the downward tilt of the chin to avoid eye contact, the rhythmic, soothing sound of a mop that signaled a servant at work rather than a predator in wait. To the men who walked these halls with guns tucked into silk holsters, she was no more significant than the ventilation system or the paint on the walls. Safety, she had discovered, was found in the mundane. Every morning at 4, she logged her thumbprint into a system that only recognized her as employee 402. She lived in the gaps of the city, in a tiny Gasiwan room where the walls were thin enough to hear the breathing of the stranger next door. But here, in the bowels of Shin Woo-jin's empire, she was truly safe. No one looks for a high-level Nigerian operative in the bucket of a cleaning trolley in Seoul. As she worked her way toward the private suites, her movements were a study in efficiency. She didn't just clean, she listened to the building. She knew which floorboards in the hall groaned under the weight of a heavy foot, which security guards took their smoke breaks 3 minutes early, and which vents carried the whispers from the high-stakes rooms above. Her mind, once trained to map the movements of the Volkov syndicate across 3 continents, now mapped the spillages of coffee and the smudges of fingerprints on glass. It was a grayscale existence, devoid of the vibrant, dangerous heat of her former life, but it was quiet. The rhythmic slap hiss of her mop against the marble was the only heartbeat she allowed herself to feel. She had spent 2 years scrubbing away the blood of a life she could no longer claim, convincing herself that she was content to be a ghost. In the service corridors, between the hum of the massive industrial refrigerators and the smell of bleach, the ghosts of Lagos couldn't find her. Her father's voice, once filled with pride at her recruitment into the agency, was a dull ache she kept locked behind a mental firewall. She reached the heavy, soundproofed doors of the executive wing. The air changed here, growing thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold, sharp ozone of high-end air conditioning. Usually she would turn back, leaving the deep cleaning for the night shift, but a specific directive had come down this morning. The Polaris suite needed to be immaculate for an unscheduled summit. She pushed her cart forward, the wheels squeaking once before she silenced them with a practiced hand. She was the invisible woman, a vessel for secrets she never intended to use. But as she approached the threshold of the Dragon's Gate boardroom, a familiar cadence caught her ear, a sharp, Slavic consonant that didn't belong in a Korean syndicate's inner sanctum. The dead status that kept her safe was about to be tested by a language she knew all too well. The boardroom doors hummed open, exhaling a draft of chilled, pressurized air that smelled of cedarwood and impending violence. Shin Woo-jin sat at the center of the long mahogany table, a man who commanded the space by simply existing within it. His dark suit jacket was sharp, but it was the open collar that drew the eye, the way the white fabric gave way to the intricate, dark ink of tattoos crawling up his throat like shadows escaping a furnace. He didn't move as the Russian delegation settled opposite him. He merely watched, his stillness a terrifying display of absolute sovereignty. To his left sat Seo Kim. She was the picture of corporate grace, her fair skin glowing under the recessed lighting, her long black hair falling in a disciplined curtain over her shoulders. She was the bridge between two worlds, her presence anchored by a startlingly bright red tie. It was a bold, aggressive splash of color against her dark suit, a focal point that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Amara entered with her head bowed, her eyes focused on the periphery of the table where a small condensation ring marred the polished wood. She moved with the invisible fluidity of a ghost, her cleaning rag in hand, a silent witness to the collision of giants. The lead Russian, a man with a face like a scarred stone, spoke first. His voice was a guttural rumble of Moscow street slang and high-level oligarch aggression. As he spoke, Amara's internal processor, dormant for 3 years, sparked to life. The Russian was demanding a tribute for the northern shipping lanes, not a partnership but a surrender. Seoyeon leaned toward Woojin, her voice a silken, melodic stream of Korean. She wasn't translating the Russian's venom. Instead, she painted a picture of mutual respect and minor administrative adjustments. "They are honored by your presence, Chairman Shin," Seoyeon murmured in Korean, her expression one of deferential calm. "They propose a restructuring of the logistics fees to better reflect the rising costs of security." Woojin nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, thoughtful pattern against the table. He reached for his water glass, oblivious to the fact that his translator was sanitizing a declaration of war into a polite request for a review. To anyone else in the room, Seoyeon was a master of her craft, delivering perfect translations that maintained the decorum of the summit. But Amara, leaning over the edge of the table with her cloth, heard the rot beneath the melody. She recognized the specific turn of the Russian's phrase, a tactical idiom used by the Bratva when they were preparing to seize a port by force. Seoyeon wasn't just a bridge. She was a barricade, intentionally keeping Woojin in the dark while the Russians tightened the noose. The red tie at Seoyeon's throat caught the light, and for a split second, Amara saw the slight, unnatural rigidity in the knot. It wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a beacon. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a visible, vibrating frequency. As Amara moved to the other side of the table, the air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the weight of the lie. The lead Russian leaned forward, his silver-capped tooth catching the light as he uttered a single, low-frequency phrase, "Slepiite seli gotovi." The words hit Amara with the force of a physical blow. The damp cloth in her hand stilled against the mahogany. The blind targets are ready. In an instant, the sterile, chilled air of the Seoul boardroom was replaced by the humid, heavy heat of a windowless office in Lagos. The smell of bleach gave way to the metallic tang of overheating servers and the copper scent of spilled hibiscus tea. She was back in the operations room of the NIA, her eyes glued to a monitor flashing with the exact same Russian military cipher. She had been the one to decode it, the warning that a cleanup crew was en route to eliminate her unit. She had shouted the alarm, but the betrayal had already been wired into the very walls. The memory flickered like a damaged film reel. The sudden, deafening crack of a flashbang, the smell of ozone, and the sight of her mentor slumped over his desk. His own, perfect, translations silenced forever by a bullet from a man he had trusted. She had survived only by the grace of a service elevator and a leap into the dark, leaving behind a life that was incinerated before she reached the street. The Volkov Bratva had been the architects of that fire, and the Nigerian officials who sold her out had been the ones to light the match. "Is there a problem with the service?" The sharp, clipped question from Seoyeon snapped the tether to the past. Amara didn't look up, but she felt the translator's cold gaze boring into the back of her braided hair. Amara forced her muscles to relax, her fingers resuming their slow, rhythmic wipe of the table. She was a cleaner. She was a ghost. Ghosts didn't have memories. They didn't have hearts that hammered against their ribs like trapped birds. But the Russian wasn't finished. He looked at Seoyeon and gave a curt, imperceptible nod. "Everything is in place," he growled in his native tongue, his eyes flicking to the red tie at her throat. "Once the chairman signs the revised security annex, the blind targets will be eliminated." Seoyeon's voice remained a silken caress as she turned back to Shin Woo-jin, her Korean flawless and deferential. "He says that with your signature on this addendum, Chairman, The brotherhood between your organizations will be sealed in blood and honor. He is eager to begin this new era of cooperation. Amara felt a cold fury, sharp as a glass shard, slice through her fear. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, it was a choreography of slaughter. She saw Woo Jin's hand move toward the leather-bound folder, his knuckles relaxed, his trust misplaced in a woman who was currently marking him for the grave. The ghost of Lagos whispered in Amara's ear, a low, urgent hum. She had run once and lost everything. If she remained a ghost now, she would be the one holding the match for Woo Jin's funeral pyre. The grayscale world was bleeding into a violent, urgent red. The leather folder lay open on the table like a waiting trap, its pages crisp and white against the dark mahogany. Shin Woo Jin reached for a heavy silver fountain pen, his gaze tracking the lines of the Korean text Seoyeon had prepared. To him, the document represented a territorial stabilization, a peaceful handover of the Busan dockside perimeters in exchange for a cessation of Russian interference. But as Amara moved toward the head of the table, her eyes swept over the technical annexes visible over his shoulder, and the intelligence analyst within her screamed. The Russian lead spoke again, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that filled the silent gaps of the room. He used the term pustaya obolochka, a slang term from the St. Petersburg docks meaning a hollow shell. He was describing the warehouses in the handover zone, laughing behind his eyes because he knew what was hidden in the floorboards. Seoyeon didn't skip a beat. She leaned into Woo Jin's personal space, the scent of her expensive perfume masking the cold scent of the betrayal. The Russian side confirms that the warehouses are empty and ready for your immediate inspection, she translated, her voice soft and reassuring. They are providing you with full custodial rights over the sector by midnight. But Amara saw the discrepancy in the fine print of the Korean draft. Seoyeon hadn't used the legal term for custodial rights. She had used a specific, archaic administrative term that, in a maritime context, allowed for third-party transit without inspection for a period of 48 hours after the transfer. It was a Trojan horse. By signing this, Woo Jin wasn't gaining a territory. He was legally inviting a Russian strike team to move through his gates, unseen and unchecked. The trap was masterfully set. It was a linguistic sleight of hand that relied on the subtle nuance of a single Hanja character. If Woo Jin signed, he would be dead before the ink was dry, his own legal department unable to find the loophole until they were identifying his body. Amara's breath hitched. She was currently polishing the edge of the table just inches from Woo Jin's elbow. She could see the faint pulse in his neck, the steady rhythm of a man who believed he had won. Opposite him, the Russians were already exchanging looks of predatory satisfaction. They didn't even bother to hide it anymore. They saw only a powerful man being led to the cliff and a black woman in a blue uniform who was as significant to them as the dust she was supposed to be clearing. The weight of the knowledge was a physical pressure, a heat rising from her chest to her throat. Every instinct developed in the shadows of Lagos told her to keep moving, to finish the table and disappear back into the service corridors where the air was safe. But she looked at the red tie on Seoyeon, the vibrant, pulsing signal of a traitor, and then at the pen in Woo Jin's hand. The bridge was not just compromised, it was rigged with explosives. If she didn't cut the wire now, the explosion would bury them. The silver pen hovered just millimeters above the signature line. Shin Woo Jin's thumb shifted, preparing to apply the pressure that would seal his fate. The Russians had stopped breathing, their eyes fixed on the nib of the pen like wolves watching a latch slip. Amara knew the window was closing. In a few seconds, the legal Trojan horse would be activated. And the blind targets would be painted with digital crosshairs. She didn't hesitate. With a calculated, clumsy jerk of her elbow, she struck the edge of a heavy crystal carafe positioned at the center of the table. The vessel tipped with a sharp, melodic chime against the mahogany, sending a violent wave of iced water surging across the surface. The flood rushed toward the leather folder, soaking the bottom edge of the document and spilling directly into Shin Woo Jin's lap. "Oh, Josonghamnida, I am so sorry, sir." Amara's voice was a frantic, high-pitched blur of practiced incompetence. The room snapped. Woo Jin lurched back, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he stood to avoid the cold deluge. The Americans, if they had been there, might have cursed, but the Russians simply snarled, their faces contorting in sudden, jagged fury at the interruption. Seo-yeon's mask of composure shattered for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with a lethal, predatory heat as she glared at the clumsy cleaner. "You stupid woman," Seo-yeon hissed in Korean, her voice losing its silken quality. "Get out, move." Amara didn't move away. Instead, she lunged forward with a bundle of white linen napkins, her movements frantic and apologetic. She dropped to her knees beside Woo Jin, dabbing frantically at the table and his suit jacket. In the chaos of the spill, as the security guards stepped forward and the Russians barked questions about the status of the papers, a temporary pocket of privacy formed between the cleaner and the king. She was close enough now to smell the sharp metallic scent of his cologne and the faint, bitter aroma of the ink. Her hands were shaking, not with the fake fear of a servant, but with the raw electricity of a woman reclaiming her power. As she leaned in to dry the table directly in front of him, she positioned her body to shield his line of sight from the rest of the room. The Russians were distracted, arguing with each other about the ruined document. Seo-yeon was busy trying to salvage the signature page from the water. In that singular, vibrating moment of curated disorder, Amara's hand moved with the precision of the analyst she used to be. She didn't look at Woo Jin's face, but she felt his gaze drop down to her. Under the cover of the damp white linen, she slid a small, tightly folded square of paper, torn from her cleaning log, into the palm of his hand. Her fingers brushed his, a spark of cold reality passing between them. The note was small, but its weight was astronomical. She felt his fingers close instinctively around the paper, his muscles tensing as he realized this was no accident. The distraction had served its purpose. She had bridged the gap between the ghost and the man who held the power of life and death. The air in the room seemed to solidify, turning into a heavy, suffocating pressure as Shin Woo-jin's fingers tightened around the scrap of paper. Amara remained on her knees, her head bowed in a posture of profound apology, but every nerve ending was screaming. She was close enough to see the fine grain of the leather on his shoes and the slight tremor of the water as it dripped from the table's edge. She had crossed the line. The invisible barrier that protected a ghost had been incinerated the moment her skin brushed his. 3 seconds. In the first second, the world went silent. The Russians' guttural complaints and Seo-yeon's sharp rebukes faded into a distant, underwater hum. Amara felt the weight of the handgun tucked into the waistband of the guard, standing just 2 feet behind her. She expected the cold snap of a holster, the heavy impact of a boot, or the sudden, searing heat of a bullet. She was a black woman in a service uniform who had just touched the most powerful man in the Seoul underworld. In their world, such a breach was often answered with immediate, terminal force. In the second, she felt Woo Jin's stillness change. It was no longer the stillness of a predator at rest. It was the chilling, focused silence of a bomb with a lit fuse. He didn't pull his hand away. He didn't call for his security. Under the shroud of the damp napkins, his thumb swiped across the texture of the paper, confirming its reality. Amara's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a Morse code of terror that only she could hear. She had gambled her life on the hope that a man built on power would value the truth more than he valued his pride. In the 3rd second, he moved, but it wasn't the move she anticipated. Woo Jin didn't strike her. Instead, he slowly brought his hand up, shielding the movement as he adjusted his jacket. In one fluid, practiced motion, he flicked the note open within the curve of his palm, his eyes scanning the scribbled words with the speed of a man used to reading death warrants. "Your translator works for the Russians. Check the tie." The silence in the room broke. The Russians stepped forward, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the wet floor. Seo-yeon reached for the wet document, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and urgency. "Chairman, please, the woman is a fool. We can print a fresh copy immediately. We should not let this accident delay our progress." Amara finally looked up, her gaze meeting Woo Jin's for a fleeting electric moment. His eyes were no longer surprised. They were twin pools of frozen obsidian, reflecting a terrifying clarity. He looked at Seo-yeon, then his gaze drifted, slowly, deliberately, to the knot of her bright red tie. The realization hit him like a physical blow, though his face remained a mask of stone. He knew. The ghost had spoken, and the bridge of lies had begun to crumble. Amara pulled back, retreating into the shadows of the corner, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The fuse was lit. Shin Woo-jin sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate, like a glacier settling into place. The soaked document remained untouched on the table, a sodden testament to a dead deal. He didn't look at the Russians, nor did he acknowledge Amara, who stood trembling in the periphery with her bucket and mop. His focus was entirely on Seo-yeon. He watched her for a moment, his gaze tracing the lines of her face before coming to rest on the vibrant silk of her red tie. It was a beautiful knot, tight and perfect, hiding a betrayal that hummed at the base of her throat. Seo-yeon, he said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational register that sent a shiver through the room. Tell our guests that I am concerned about the weather. Tell them the fog in Busan is getting thick, and I fear for the safety of their incoming shipments. The lead Russian frowned, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't mentioned fog. He hadn't mentioned shipments. Seo-yeon hesitated, her tongue darting out to lick her lips. She turned to the Russians and spoke in a rapid-fire Russian that was sharp and clinical. Amara, clutching her cleaning rag, heard the true translation. He is suspicious. The cleaner did something. We need to move the strike team up. Now. Seo-yeon turned back to Woo-jin, her smile returning like a flickering neon sign. They say they appreciate your concern, Chairman, and they assure you that their navigation systems are the best in the world. The fog will not be an issue for the transition. The lie was a bridge made of glass, and Woo-jin had just stepped onto it with all his weight. He didn't blink. He reached out and grabbed Seo-yeon's wrist, his grip so sudden and violent that the water glass on the table rattled. The room went dead silent. The Russian lead reached into his coat, his hand closing around the grip of a Makarov. You didn't tell them about the fog, Seo-yeon, Woo-jin whispered in English, his voice a rasp of chilled steel. And they didn't tell me about their navigation. He stood up, pulling her toward him until she was inches from his face. With his free hand, he reached out and gripped the knot of her red tie. He didn't pull it, he squeezed. There was a faint, metallic crunch, the sound of a micro-transmitter being crushed between his fingers. Seo-yeon's eyes went wide, the pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated terror. The targets aren't blind anymore, Woo-jin growled, repeating the Russian code phrase Amara had identified. The explosion of violence was surgical. Before the Russian could draw his weapon, Woo-jin's security team, having read the shift in their boss's posture, vaulted over the table. The air was filled with the heavy thud of fists against flesh and the sharp, muffled cracks of suppressed gunfire. The Russian lead was slammed face first into the mahogany, the wood splintering under the impact. Seo-yeon was thrown to the floor, her red tie discarded like a severed tongue. Amara pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She watched as the room she had spent months cleaning was transformed into a slaughterhouse of failed ambition. In the center of the chaos, Woo-jin stood unmoved, a king who had finally opened his eyes. He looked over the carnage, his gaze sweeping the room until it found Amara in the shadows. For the first time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. The chaos subsided into a heavy, metallic silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. The Russians had been neutralized, dragged out like refuse through the service exits, and Seo-yeon was gone, escorted by guards whose expressions promised a long, cold night of questioning. The boardroom, once a temple of high-stakes diplomacy, was now a wreckage of shattered crystal and spilled secrets. Shin Woo-jin stood at the head of the table, adjusting his cuffs with the same methodical calm he had shown during the negotiation. He didn't look like a man who had just narrowly escaped an assassination. He looked like a man who had finally found the missing variable in a complex equation. He turned his head slowly, his obsidian eyes locking onto Amara. She was still pressed against the wall, her hands trembling as she clutched her blue apron, the cleaning trolley a flimsy shield between her and the sudden gravity of his attention. "Come here," he commanded. It wasn't a threat, but it carried the absolute weight of his station. Amara stepped forward, her soft-soled shoes silent on the damp floor. As she approached, the security team retreated into the shadows of the room, leaving a circle of forced intimacy between the cleaner and the boss. Woo-jin reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled note she had given him. He smoothed it out on the table, staring at the English script. "You knew their slang," he began, his voice low. "You knew the technicalities of a maritime transit clause, and you knew the frequency of a Russian signal jammer hidden in a silk tie." He looked up, his gaze piercing through her carefully constructed mask. "I have had cleaners in this building for 10 years. Most of them cannot tell the difference between a contract and a cocktail napkin. But you are an auditor of lies." Amara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I was just doing my job, sir." "Your job is to clean floors, Amara Okoye, not to dismantle international conspiracies," he countered. He leaned forward, his tattoos rippling as he rested his weight on the table. "I did a background check while my men were clearing the room. Your identity in Seoul is a masterpiece of fiction. You are a ghost, but ghosts do not have the eyes of a hunter. I see the intelligence analyst behind the blue fabric. I see the woman who was burned in Lagos." The mention of her home hit her like a physical blow. The secret she had guarded with her life was laid bare on the mahogany. "I do not offer you money," Woo-jin said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Money is for servants. I offer you a trade. I have assets in West Africa, shipping lanes, digital networks, and men who owe me their lives. You saved my empire tonight. In return, I will use my reach to find the men who turned you into a ghost. I will give you the names, the locations, and the means to finish what they started." He held her gaze, a silent contract forming in the space between them. "I do not need a cleaner. I need an architect, someone who can see the traps before I walk into them." Amara looked at her calloused hands, then back at the man who had just offered her the one thing she thought was gone forever, her life. The grayscale world was fading. The bridge wasn't burned. It was being rebuilt in steel. The blue service uniform felt like a heavy, restrictive skin as Amara unzipped it for the last time in the dim light of the staff locker room. For years, the fabric had been her armor, a shroud of forced insignificance that allowed her to move through the world without being seen. She folded it neatly, placing it on the bench beside the industrial-sized bottle of bleach and the worn cleaning rags. She was leaving the ghost behind in the shadows of the service corridor, trading the safety of invisibility for the weight of a weapon. When she emerged from the back entrance of the Dragon's Gate, she was no longer employee 402. She wore a dark, tailored coat provided by Woo-jin's people, the silk lining a sharp contrast to the rough cotton she had worn for years. The night air of Seoul was crisp, smelling of rain and asphalt, but for the first time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. A sleek black sedan was idling at the curb. The door was held open by a man who had, only hours ago, looked through her as if she were made of glass. Now he bowed. As Amara slid into the leather interior, she found a thick, cream-colored envelope waiting on the seat. Her fingers, still smelling faintly of lemon water and adrenaline, traced the embossed seal of Shin Woo-jin's private office. Inside was the dossier. It was more than just a list of names. It was a roadmap to her resurrection. She saw the digital fingerprints of the Omni Corp executives who had coordinated with the Volkov Bratva to burn her unit in Lagos. She saw bank records, encrypted communication logs, and the current coordinates of the man who had pulled the trigger on her mentor. Woo-jin had been thorough. He hadn't just given her information, he had given her the keys to a kingdom of retribution. "Where to, Ms. Okoye?" the driver asked, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror with a new, guarded respect. Amara looked out at the city lights, the neon signs of Seoul blurring into a vibrant, electric streak. The grayscale existence she had endured was over. The trauma of the fire had been replaced by a cold, calculating fire of her own. She thought of her father's voice, of the integrity he had died for, and realized that she was finally honoring it, not by hiding, but by standing as the bridge between crime and its consequence. "The airport," she said, her voice resonant and clear, stripped of the hesitant lilt of a servant. "I have a legacy to reclaim." She leaned back, the dossier resting heavy in her lap like a shield. She was no longer a survivor clinging to the edges of someone else's world. She was an architect of justice, backed by the most dangerous man in the city, and she was going home to burn down the house of those who had thought she was dead. The cleaner was gone, the hunter had arrived.